A soldier returns home to reunite with his wife after 1 year deployed overseas. He is shocked to discover she has been hiding a terrible secret from him. The sun was just beginning to set as Elliot Carter stood on the porch of his home. The familiar creak of the wooden step beneath his boots sent a wave of nostalgia through him. A year away, a year of sand and sweat, and now he was finally back. He raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. For the first time in his life, he felt like a stranger at his own door. With a deep breath, he rapped his knuckles against the door. The sound echoed faintly before silence reclaimed the evening. He waited, shifting his duffel bag on his shoulder. Inside, he heard hurried footsteps. Then the door cracked open. Hannah stood there, eyes widened, and for a moment, Elliot saw pure shock flicker across her face. Then she smiled, small, tight, like she was forcing it into place. "Elliot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, babe," he replied, his tone gentle but edged with uncertainty. He dropped his bag and opened his arms, stepping closer. "Miss me?" She hesitated for a split second before stepping into his embrace, her arms wrapped around him, but there was a stiffness to her hold, a hesitation he couldn't ignore. He closed his eyes, inhaling the familiar scent of her lavender shampoo, trying to convince himself that everything was fine. "I wasn't expecting you so soon," she murmured into his chest. "I wanted to surprise you," he said, pulling back to look at her. "You don't look too happy about it." Her cheeks flushed, and she glanced away. "I'm happy. It's been a long day." He frowned, studying her. Her face looked thinner, and there were faint shadows beneath her eyes. She looked tired. "No, weary. You okay? You look different." "I'm fine," she said quickly, stepping aside. "Come in. You must be exhausted." Elliot picked up his bag and stepped inside. The house was warm, cozy, but it felt off somehow. The furniture was where he remembered it, but there was a faint layer of dust on the mantel. The plants she used to tend religiously were wilted. The air had a strange stillness to it, as though the house had been holding its breath while he was gone. Hannah hovered behind him, her hands clasped tightly together. "I made lasagna earlier. It's in the fridge. I can heat it up for you." He turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What's going on, Hannah?" Her eyes darted to the floor. "What do you mean? You don't seem happy to see me. The house feels neglected, and you're acting strange." He took a step closer, his voice softening. "Did something happen while I was gone?" "No, nothing happened," she said quickly, too quickly. "Hannah," she bit her lip, then forced a smile. "It's just been a long year, Elliot. I'm not used to having someone here anymore. Give me a little time, okay?" He studied her, searching her face for answers she wasn't giving. Finally, he nodded, though unease still churned in his gut. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet. "But if something's wrong, you'd tell me, right?" "Of course," she said, her smile tightening further. "Now, let me heat up that lasagna." As she disappeared into the kitchen, Elliot sat down on the couch, his gaze drifting to the pictures on the wall. They were the same as before, smiling faces, happy memories, but now they felt like ghosts. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the air, in the way she moved, in the way she avoided his eyes. And yet, he said nothing. Instead, he leaned back, letting the weight of the silence settle over him. He was home, but for the first time, it didn't feel like home at all. Elliot woke early the next morning, the familiar weight of routine pulling him from sleep. The room was dimly lit by the gray light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Beside him, Hannah stirred, her back turned to him. He watched her for a moment, noting how her shoulder blades seemed sharper under the fabric of her pajama top. He slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. As he brewed a pot of coffee, he noticed a stack of unopened mail on the counter. Bills, mostly, judging by the envelopes. That wasn't like Hannah. She was meticulous about keeping the house in order, about staying on top of things. By the time Hannah entered the kitchen, Elliot was at the table with a steaming mug of coffee. She wore her robe loosely tied, her hair messily pulled back. She looked startled to see him there, though she quickly masked it with a small smile. "Morning," she said, reaching for the kettle. "Morning," he replied, watching her closely. You sleep okay? Yeah. You? He shrugged. Takes some getting used to. Sleeping in a real bed again? She nodded, pouring herself tea. The silence stretched between them, heavy and awkward. Finally, Elliot broke it. You still working from home? Hannah sat down across from him, cradling her mug. Yeah, business has been slow lately, though. Slow? He frowned. You were swamped before I left. What happened? She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her tea. Clients come and go, I guess. It's just a dry spell. He didn't believe her. Something in her tone, flat, almost rehearsed, set him on edge. He decided to press further. I could help, you know. I've got some time before I start looking for work. Hannah stiffened slightly. You don't need to worry about that. I've got it under control. I'm not saying you don't. I just want to pitch in where I can. Her lips curved into a thin smile. I appreciate it, but I'll manage. Elliot leaned back in his chair, studying her. The woman sitting across from him looked like his wife, but something fundamental had shifted. She was guarded in a way he didn't recognize, like there was a wall between them that hadn't been there before. He thought about their conversation the night before, how quickly she had deflected his questions. Are you sure everything's okay? He asked gently. You seem different. Hannah's smile faltered. I told you, Elliot, it's just been a long year. Adjusting takes time. Adjusting to what? He pressed. You've been here, in the same house, living the same life. What's changed? Her grip on the mug tightened, her knuckles turning white. You being gone changed everything, she snapped, her voice sharp. Then, just as quickly, she softened. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Elliot held up a hand. It's fine, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I get it. Things were hard for you while I was away. I just want to understand. She sighed, setting her mug down. I don't even understand half of it myself, Elliot. Can we not do this right now? He nodded slowly, though the unease in his chest didn't abate. Okay, but you'll tell me if something's wrong, right? Of course, she said, echoing the same words from the night before. They sounded hollow now, as if she were saying them more for his benefit than because they were true. The rest of the morning passed in strained politeness. Hannah busied herself with cleaning the kitchen, though Elliot noticed how she avoided the cabinets he offered to open or the heavier dishes he volunteered to carry. She was tired, more than tired, really, and she was hiding it poorly. When she disappeared upstairs for a midday nap, Elliot found himself wandering the house. He checked the garden, overgrown and neglected, a sharp contrast to the vibrant blooms Hannah had once cared for religiously. Inside, he noticed dust gathering on surfaces she used to wipe down daily. It was like the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for him to notice the cracks. Later that afternoon, Jason Riley dropped by. The knock on the door was brisk, a sharp contrast to Hannah's hesitant demeanor. Elliot opened it to find his old buddy standing there, grinning ear to ear. Figured you'd need some company, Jason said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Elliot chuckled. You figured, right? Jason glanced around, his grin faltering. Place looks a little different. Everything okay? Elliot hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, just settling back in. Jason gave him a skeptical look, but didn't push. Instead, he clapped a hand on Elliot's shoulder and steered him toward the couch. Come on, let's catch up. The conversation was light at first, filled with stories of their time in the service and Jason's antics since returning home. But as the afternoon wore on, Jason's tone shifted. You sure everything's good with you and Hannah? He asked, his voice low. Elliot looked toward the stairs, where Hannah was still resting. I don't know, man. Something feels off. She's not herself. Jason nodded slowly. Maybe she just needs time. Years a long time to be apart. Yeah, Elliot said, though he didn't sound convinced. As Jason left later that evening, Elliot stood at the door, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sense of unease that had been gnawing at him since he returned was only growing stronger. Something was wrong, and Elliot wasn't sure he had the patience to wait for Hannah to tell him what it was. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. Elliot sat on the couch, staring at the muted television. Hannah had gone to bed early, claiming a headache. He didn't press her. She seemed exhausted, more so than usual. Still, the nagging feeling in his gut wouldn't let him rest. He stood, pacing the living room, the floor creaking beneath his weight. His eyes wandered to the bookshelf near the corner, where a small drawer sat tucked into the base. It had always been Hannah's safe space for her papers, old receipts, sketches, and personal notes. Curiosity gnawed at him. Maybe something in there would explain her distance. He crouched down and tugged the drawer open. A mess of papers greeted him. Envelopes, loose sheets, and one familiar leather-bound journal. He sifted through them carefully, not wanting to disturb the order too much. Then he saw it, an envelope, yellowed at the edges with his name scrawled across the front. His heart stopped. The handwriting was unmistakably Hannah's. He pulled it out, noting the way the seal had never been broken. The letter hadn't been sent. For a moment, he hesitated. This felt intrusive, like prying into something not meant for him. But she had addressed it to him. That had to mean something, didn't it? Hands trembling slightly, he unfolded the paper inside. The first line hit him like a punch to the chest. "Elliot, I don't even know where to start. By the time you read this, I might not even be here anymore." His eyes scanned the rest of the letter, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. "I didn't want to tell you while you were deployed. I couldn't burden you with this when you had enough to worry about. But I've been diagnosed with something serious. The doctors don't know how bad it is yet, but the odds aren't great. I'm starting treatment soon, and I hope it works. But I need to prepare for the possibility that it won't." Elliot's breathing quickened as he kept reading. His heart pounded so loudly in his ears that he barely heard the words, yet they carved themselves into his mind. "Please know that I never wanted to keep this from you. I just couldn't bear the thought of you halfway across the world, carrying this weight on top of everything else. I love you more than anything, and I hope I'll get to tell you that in person. But if I don't, I'm sorry." The letter fell from his hands, fluttering to the floor. He sat back on his heels, his mind racing. Illness? Treatment? Why hadn't she told him? Why had she thought she needed to go through this alone? He stood abruptly, his body moving before his mind caught up. Upstairs, the bedroom door was slightly ajar, the soft glow of a lamp spilling into the hallway. He stepped inside to find Hannah curled up on her side, her breathing steady and rhythmic. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at her fragile form. "Wake up," he said, his voice firm but not loud. She stirred, blinking blearily at him. "Elliot, what's going on?" "Get up," he said, sharper now. He reached for the lamp and flicked it brighter. Hannah sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" He laughed bitterly. "I should be asking you that. You want to tell me about this?" He held up the letter, shaking it slightly for emphasis. Her face drained of color. "Where did you—" "Doesn't matter where I found it," he snapped. "What matters is why you never sent it. Or better yet, why you never told me any of this." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her lips trembling. "Elliot, You hid this from me," he said, his voice rising. "You went through cancer treatments by yourself while I was halfway around the world? What the hell, Hannah? I didn't want to worry you," she said, her voice small. "Worry me? You think I wouldn't want to know something like this? You think I'd rather come home to a wife who's been fighting for her life alone?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered. "Protecting me?" He shook his head, pacing the room now. "No, you were protecting yourself from having to see me hurt, from having to admit you couldn't handle it alone." "That's not fair," she said, her voice breaking. "You weren't here, Elliot. You don't know what it was like." "Exactly," he shouted, turning to face her. "I wasn't here because you didn't let me be. You decided for both of us, Hannah. Do you know how much that hurts?" Her tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't know what else to do," she sobbed. "I was scared. I didn't think I'd make it. I didn't want you to—" "To what? To suffer?" His voice softened, but the edge of frustration remained. "You don't think I've been suffering since I got back? Watching you pull away, acting like everything's fine when it clearly isn't? You think that's easier?" Hannah didn't answer, her shoulders shaking as she cried. Elliot sank down onto the edge of the bed, his anger giving way to exhaustion. "You should have told me," he said quietly. "We're supposed to face things together, Hannah. That's what marriage is. You don't get to decide to leave me out." "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I know, and I'm sorry. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for her quiet sobs. Elliot sat with his head in his hands, trying to steady his breathing. The letter was still crumpled in his fist. Finally, he looked up at her. Are you okay now? The treatments, did they work? Hannah hesitated, wiping at her tears. I don't know. I haven't gone back for the last few scans. Elliot stared at her in disbelief. What do you mean you haven't gone back? I didn't want to know, she admitted. I couldn't handle more bad news. He shook his head, standing abruptly. That's not an option anymore. First thing tomorrow, you're calling your doctor. We're doing this, Hannah, together. She nodded, her face pale and tear-streaked. Okay, she said weakly. Elliot sat back down, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him tightly, as though afraid he might vanish. For the first time since he'd come home, he felt like they were finally on the same side of the fight. But the battle was far from over. The following morning, the weight of the previous night lingered in the air. Elliot and Hannah sat in the living room, coffee cups in hand, though neither seemed interested in drinking. The morning sun cast long shadows across the room, its warmth failing to thaw the tension between them. Elliot leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at his untouched coffee. So, he began, his voice heavy, tell me everything. Hannah shifted in her seat, her fingers trembling as she set her cup on the table. I don't even know where to start. Start at the beginning, he said, his tone firmer than he intended. When did you find out? She swallowed hard, looking down at her lap. Last spring, a few months after you deployed. Elliot's jaw tightened, his grip on the coffee mug tightening. And you just decided to keep it to yourself? I didn't decide that right away, she said, her voice defensive. At first, I thought about telling you. I even wrote that letter. Her eyes flicked toward the crumpled envelope on the table. But then I kept thinking about how far away you were, how much you were already dealing with. So, you made the choice for me, Elliot interrupted, his voice laced with frustration. You thought I couldn't handle it. It wasn't like that, she said quickly, tears pooling in her eyes. I thought I was sparing you. I thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing would have been letting me be there for you. He shot back. Do you know how much it hurts to know you went through this alone? That you didn't trust me enough to tell me? Hannah flinched at his words, her tears spilling over. It wasn't about trust, Elliot. It was about survival. I was barely holding it together. Adding your worry to that would have— Don't, he interrupted, standing abruptly. He began pacing the room, his hands on his hips. Don't make this about protecting me. This was about you not wanting to show weakness. Her sobs grew louder as she covered her face with her hands. I was scared, she cried, her voice breaking. I didn't know how to handle it, okay? I thought I was going to die, and I didn't want your last memory of me to be this. Elliot stopped pacing, her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He turned to face her, his expression softening as he saw the raw pain in her eyes. Hannah, he said quietly, sitting back down across from her, I would have wanted to be there. Even if it was hard, even if it hurt, I would have chosen to be with you through all of it. She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face full of regret. I know that now. But at the time, I just wanted to protect you. He shook his head slowly, his frustration giving way to sadness. You can't protect me by shutting me out. That's not how this works. She nodded, her lips trembling. I'm sorry, Elliot. I know I messed up. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the truth settling between them. Finally, Elliot leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. What about the treatments? He asked, his voice calmer now. You said you don't know if they worked. Why? Hannah hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. I finished the treatments a few months ago, but I couldn't bring myself to go back for the follow-up scans. Elliot's brows furrowed. Why not? I was terrified, she admitted. What if they didn't work? What if they told me it was worse? I thought, if I didn't know, I could pretend everything was fine. I could focus on getting through each day without falling apart. He stared at her, his heart breaking at the vulnerability in her voice. Hannah, you can't live like that. Not knowing doesn't make it go away. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I didn't know how to face it. Not alone. Elliot reached out, taking her hands in his. You're not alone anymore. I'm here now, and we're going to face it together. No more hiding, no more pretending. We're in this, no matter what. Her grip tightened on his, and she nodded, her tears falling freely. Okay, she said, her voice trembling. I'll call the doctor. You're not doing it alone, he said firmly. We'll go together. For the first time in what felt like forever, a small smile broke through her tears. Thank you, Elliot. He gave her hands a reassuring squeeze. We're going to get through this, whatever it takes. The sun had risen higher now, bathing the room in a warmer light. For the first time since his return, Elliot felt like they were finally breaking through the wall that had been between them. The road ahead would be hard, but for the first time, they were ready to face it together. The night had barely begun when Elliot heard it again, the muffled sound of coughing coming from the bathroom. He sat up in bed, his pulse quickening. It had been like this for days now. Every night, Hannah slipped out of bed, trying to stifle the fits, but he always heard her. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and padded softly to the door. The faint light under the bathroom door flickered. He knocked gently, his voice low but firm. Hannah, are you okay? There was a pause, then a shaky, muffled response. I'm fine, Elliot. Go back to bed. He clenched his jaw. I'm not going anywhere. Open the door. The sound of coughing came again, louder this time, followed by the rush of water from the faucet. When the door finally creaked open, Hannah stood there, pale and trembling. Her face was damp, her eyes red and glassy. She clutched the edge of the sink for support, swaying slightly. You don't look fine, Elliot said, his voice tight with concern. He stepped closer, steadying her as she wobbled. Come on, let's get you back to bed. I don't need, she started, but the sentence dissolved into another violent coughing fit. This time, Elliot saw it. Bright red blood streaked across the tissue she brought to her mouth. His heart stopped. Hannah, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. How long has this been happening? She shook her head, tears spilling over. It's nothing. I'm fine. Nothing? His voice cracked, anger and fear bubbling to the surface. You're coughing up blood, Hannah. That's not nothing. I didn't want to scare you, she whispered, her voice trembling. You just got home. I didn't want to ruin everything. Ruin everything? He ran a hand over his face, his frustration palpable. You're killing yourself trying to keep me in the dark. That's what you're doing. Her knees buckled, and he caught her before she fell, scooping her into his arms. That's it. We're going to the hospital. Now. Elliot, no, she protested weakly, her head lolling against his chest. I just need rest. You need help, he said firmly, his voice brooking no argument. And you're getting it. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Hannah slumped in the passenger seat, her breathing shallow and labored. Elliot gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Every glance at her pale face only fueled his fear. When they arrived, he carried her into the emergency room, shouting for help. Nurses rushed to their side, whisking Hannah away while Elliot was left behind, pacing the waiting room like a caged animal. Hours passed. Every time a nurse or doctor walked by, he sprang to his feet, only to be told to wait. The helplessness gnawed at him, the unknown stretching his nerves to their breaking point. Finally, Dr. Simmons appeared, her face grim but composed. Mr. Carter? Elliot strode toward her, his voice urgent. How is she? What's going on? Dr. Simmons motioned for him to sit, but he refused. Your wife's condition has worsened significantly, she said. The cancer appears to have progressed aggressively. She's developed complications, including severe anemia and fluid buildup in her lungs. Elliot felt the room tilt slightly, his breath catching. What does that mean? Can you fix it? We're stabilizing her for now, Dr. Simmons said carefully, but her body is weak, and the treatments we've been using aren't working as we'd hoped. We need to explore more aggressive options, possibly chemotherapy or surgery, but it's going to be a long, difficult road. Do whatever you have to, Elliot said, his voice firm. Just make sure she makes it. Doctor, Simmons hesitated. I have to be honest, Mr. Carter. Even with treatment, her chances are uncertain. She's very sick. Elliot stared at her, his heart hammering. The words felt like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. But he straightened, his resolve hardening. I don't care about the odds. You do everything you can, and I'll do everything I can to keep her fighting. Dr. Simmons nodded. She's lucky to have someone like you by her side. I'll keep you updated." Hours later, Elliot was allowed to see Hannah. She lay in a hospital bed, a pale shadow of the woman he had left a year ago. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with effort. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, their soft beeps a reminder of how fragile she had become. He sank into the chair beside her, taking her cold hand in his. Her eyes fluttered open, and she turned her head weakly toward him. "Hey," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hey," he said, his throat tight. "You scared the hell out of me." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Sorry, don't be," he said, his voice breaking. "Just don't leave me, okay? You promised we'd face this together." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so tired, Elliot." "I know," he said, leaning closer, his forehead resting against hers. "But you're not fighting alone anymore. You hear me? I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Her fingers tightened weakly around his. "I'll try," she whispered, "for you." Elliot closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would fight for her every step of the way, even if it killed him. The hospital room was dimly lit, the only sound the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the faint rustle of sheets as Hannah shifted restlessly in her bed. Elliot sat beside her, his elbows on his knees, watching her with a mix of worry and helplessness. She hadn't said much all day, her silence more unsettling than any of the physical signs of her illness. It was late now, the kind of quiet hour when emotions felt heavier and thoughts couldn't be escaped. Hannah turned her head toward him, her face pale and drawn. "Elliot?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. He leaned closer, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. "I'm here," he said softly. "What's wrong?" Her lip quivered as tears filled her eyes. "I don't think I can do this anymore." The words pierced him, a raw pain tightening his chest. "Don't say that," he said quickly, his voice firm but gentle. "You're doing so well. You're fighting." "I'm not," she whispered, her tears spilling over. I'm so tired, Elliot. Tired of being sick. Tired of pretending I'm not scared out of my mind every single second. I don't even recognize myself anymore." Her voice cracked, and the sobs she had been holding back burst free. She covered her face with her hands, her body shaking as she cried. Elliot sat frozen for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in, before he moved to her side. He knelt beside the bed, pulling her hands away from her face and holding them tightly. "Hannah," he said, his voice breaking, "you don't have to pretend, not with me. You're allowed to be scared. You're allowed to feel everything you're feeling." Her tear-filled eyes met his, desperation etched into her expression. "I don't want to die, Elliot. I'm not ready. I'm not ready to leave you." "You're not going to die," he said, his tone resolute. "Do you hear me? You're not going anywhere. We're going to get through this, together." "But what if we don't?" she cried, her voice trembling. "What if no matter how hard we fight, it's not enough? What if I can't do it?" "You can," he said firmly, his hands cupping her face now, "because you're the strongest person I know. And when you feel like you can't fight anymore, I'll fight for you. We'll take it one day at a time, one moment at a time if we have to, but we're not giving up." Her sobs slowed as his words sank in, her breathing still uneven but steadier. "I'm so scared," she whispered again, her voice cracking. "I know," he said, pressing his forehead against hers. "I'm scared too, but we've got each other, and as long as we do, we'll keep going, no matter what." She closed her eyes, her tears still falling, but quieter now. "I don't deserve you." "Don't you dare say that," he said, his voice soft but fierce. "You're my everything, Hannah. There's nowhere else I'd rather be than here, with you." She nodded weakly, leaning into him, her head resting on his shoulder. He held her tightly, his own tears slipping down his cheeks as he whispered words of comfort. "You're not alone," he murmured. "Not now, not ever." For a long time, they stayed like that, clinging to each other in the stillness of the night. The fear and pain didn't disappear, but in that moment, they felt a little less overwhelming. Together, they were stronger. Together, they would face whatever came next. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the hospital window, casting a soft golden glow over the room. Elliot stirred in the stiff chair beside Hannah's bed, blinking awake. His neck ached from the awkward position, but he didn't care. His first instinct was to check on her. Hannah was still asleep, her chest rising and falling steadily, her face more peaceful than it had been in weeks. For a moment, Elliot let himself hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to turn around. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts, and Dr. Simmons stepped in, her clipboard tucked under one arm. She greeted Elliot with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. How's she doing?" "Better, I think," Elliot said quietly, glancing at Hannah. "She slept through the night." "That's a good sign," Dr. Simmons said, her tone encouraging. "The new treatment regimen seems to be helping stabilize her condition. We're seeing small, but measurable progress." Elliot exhaled slowly, the weight on his chest lifting just slightly. "Progress," he repeated. That's something." "It's more than something," Dr. Simmons said gently. "It's hope, and right now, that's what you both need." Elliot nodded, his jaw tightening as he fought back the surge of emotion. "Thank you, Doctor." Hannah stirred then, her eyelids fluttering open. She blinked at the sunlight, her gaze landing on Elliot first, and then shifting to Dr. Simmons. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice groggy but stronger than it had been in days. "We were just talking about how well you're doing," Dr. Simmons said with a smile. "You're making progress, Hannah. It's slow, but it's there." Hannah's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time in a long while, Elliot saw a spark of life in them. "Really? Really?" Dr. Simmons confirmed. "But we need to keep up the treatments and monitor you closely. It's going to be a long road, but this is a step in the right direction." Hannah nodded slowly, her fingers clutching the blanket. "Thank you," she murmured. Dr. Simmons smiled warmly. "I'll let you rest for now. I'll check in later." She left the room, her presence leaving a quiet reassurance in her wake. Once they were alone, Hannah turned to Elliot, her eyes glistening. "Did you hear that? Progress." "I heard," he said, his voice soft but steady. "You're fighting, Hannah, and you're winning." Her lip quivered as tears filled her eyes. "I didn't think I'd ever hear good news again." "You deserve good news," he said, reaching for her hand. "You deserve all the good things in the world." "I don't know about that," she whispered, her tears spilling over, "but I know I don't want to give up. Not anymore." Elliot squeezed her hand tightly, his own tears threatening to fall. "You're the bravest person I know, and whatever it takes, we'll get through this, one step at a time." She smiled faintly, her fingers curling around his. "One step at a time," she echoed. For the first time in weeks, the heavy weight that had hung over them felt lighter. The fear and uncertainty were still there, but now they were accompanied by something new, hope, and for Elliot, that was enough to keep fighting. The day Hannah was discharged from the hospital felt like the first step into a new life. Elliot had spent the morning pacing the room, going over every instruction Dr. Simmons had given him, medications, dietary restrictions, follow-up appointments. He wanted everything to be perfect, everything ready for Hannah's return to the home they hadn't shared in weeks. Hannah, for her part, sat quietly in the wheelchair as the nurse rolled her toward the hospital exit. Her face was pale, and her frame was still too thin, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a fragile but undeniable spark of hope. "Ready to go home?" Elliot asked as he pushed open the glass doors, stepping into the crisp autumn air. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I've been ready for a long time." The drive home was quiet, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy with fear or uncertainty. It was peaceful, a shared understanding that they had crossed a threshold. Elliot glanced at her occasionally, her head leaning against the window as she watched the golden leaves blur past. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Hannah sat for a moment, staring at the house. "It feels different," she murmured, her fingers gripping the handle of the door. "Like I don't quite belong here anymore." "You belong here," Elliot said firmly. "This is your home. Always has been. Always will be." She turned to him, her eyes glassy. "It doesn't feel like mine anymore. It feels like the house of someone I used to be." Elliot reached across the console, his hand resting on hers. Then we'll make it yours again, together. Her lips curved into a faint smile, and she nodded. Okay. Inside, the house was just as they had left it. The air was slightly stale, the furniture untouched. Elliot had cleaned and straightened everything in anticipation of her return, but to Hannah, it still felt foreign. She sank into the couch, leaning back with a sigh as her eyes roamed the room. It's strange being here, she admitted. I've dreamed about it for so long, but now that I'm here, it's overwhelming. Elliot knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. You don't have to do everything at once. We'll take it slow, one day at a time. She nodded, squeezing his hand. One day at a time, she echoed softly. After helping her settle, Elliot went to the kitchen, where he had been preparing something special. The smell of chicken soup filled the air, a recipe she had always loved, one he had learned to make just for her. He carried the steaming bowl to the living room, setting it on the small table in front of her. You made this? She asked, her brows raising in surprise. He smiled sheepishly. Don't look so shocked. I've been practicing. She picked up the spoon, taking a tentative sip. Her eyes closed as the warmth spread through her. It's perfect, she murmured. Thank you. Anything for you, he said, sitting beside her. I mean it. For the first time in a long while, they shared a quiet meal together, the kind of moment that felt ordinary and extraordinary all at once. They didn't need words to fill the space. Their presence was enough. Later that evening, Hannah asked to go outside. Elliot helped her into a soft blanket and wrapped another around her shoulders as they stepped onto the back porch. The garden was a little overgrown, the flowers long past their bloom, but it was still theirs. I missed this, she said, her voice tinged with longing. Just being out here, feeling the air, hearing the leaves rustle. Elliot smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they sat together on the porch swing. It's still here, waiting for you, just like I was. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. I don't deserve you. Stop saying that, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You're my wife, Hannah. We've been through hell, but we're still here. That's what matters. She turned to him, her eyes shimmering with tears. I was so scared, Elliot. There were nights I thought I wouldn't make it, days I wanted to give up, but you never gave up on me. You kept me going. He tilted her chin up, his gaze locking with hers. And I always will. No matter what comes next, we'll face it together. She nodded, her tears spilling over as she smiled. Together. For a while they sat in silence, the swing rocking gently beneath them. The night air was cool but not cold, the stars just beginning to appear. It felt like the world had paused for them, offering a moment of peace they so desperately needed. Hannah broke the silence. I want to live, Elliot. I don't just want to survive. I want to really live. He kissed her temple, his heart swelling with pride and love. Then that's what we'll do, one step at a time, one day at a time. Her smile widened, her fingers intertwining with his. One day at a time, she repeated, her voice filled with quiet determination. As the stars came out, they sat together on the porch, the weight of the past slowly lifting. It wasn't over, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, they felt ready to face it. Together, they would rebuild their life, stronger and more united than ever before. And that was enough. 5 years later, the late afternoon sun bathed the backyard in golden light, casting long shadows across the freshly mowed lawn. Elliot stood at the edge of the garden, watching as their 4-year-old daughter, Lila, darted between the rows of flowers, her laughter ringing out like music. Hannah sat on the porch swing, her hands resting on her lap, a soft smile gracing her face. "Daddy, look!" Lila shouted, holding up a bright orange butterfly perched delicately on her finger. Elliot grinned, walking over to her. "Wow, that's a beauty," he said, crouching down to get a closer look. "Just like you." Lila giggled and carefully let the butterfly take flight, clapping her hands with delight as it fluttered away. She dashed off again, chasing another imaginary adventure, leaving Elliot to stand and glance back at Hannah. She was watching them, her eyes filled with a quiet contentment that still took his breath away. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with hints of gray, but her face had a glow of health and vitality that once felt impossible. She caught his gaze and tilted her head, motioning for him to join her. Elliot walked over and eased himself onto the swing beside her, the wood creaking softly under his weight. "She's got your energy," he said, nodding toward Lila, who was now twirling in the grass. "And your determination," Hannah added with a laugh. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining effortlessly, as they had for years now. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" "Every day," Elliot said, his voice low but steady. He turned to her, his expression softening. "I still can't believe we're here sometimes. After everything." Hannah nodded, her smile faltering slightly as her thoughts drifted back. "There were nights when I didn't think I'd see another sunrise, times when I was so scared I couldn't breathe. But you never left, Elliot. Not once. You didn't give up either," he said, squeezing her hand. "You fought harder than anyone I've ever known. I'm just lucky I got to fight with you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes misting over. "I don't know where I'd be without you. Or where Lila would be. Probably driving someone else crazy," Elliot teased, earning a soft laugh from her. They sat in silence for a while, watching Lila tumble into the grass, her face alight with joy. The years hadn't erased the struggles they'd faced, but they had softened the edges, leaving behind memories of resilience and love. Hannah had remained cancer-free for 5 years now, and every anniversary of her remission was celebrated with quiet gratitude and unspoken relief. "She doesn't know yet, does she?" Hannah asked after a while, her voice thoughtful. "About what we went through?" "No," Elliot said. "She's too young to understand. But one day, when she's older, I'll tell her how brave her mom is." Hannah smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "And I'll tell her how her dad saved me when I didn't think I could be saved." "You saved yourself, Hannah," he said firmly. "I was just lucky enough to stand by your side." She reached up and touched his cheek, her voice trembling with emotion. "You were everything, Elliot. You still are." They sat together, the swing swaying gently beneath them as the sun began to set. Lila ran up to them then, her face flushed, and her curls bouncing as she climbed into Hannah's lap. "Mommy, can we read the butterfly book tonight?" she asked, her voice full of excitement. "Of course, sweetheart," Hannah said, wrapping her arms around her. "Anything for you." Elliot watched them, his heart full. This was what they had fought for, these moments of simple, perfect joy. The battles they had faced felt distant now, like a storm that had passed, leaving the air clearer and the world brighter. As the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, Elliot tightened his grip on Hannah's hand and kissed her temple. "We did it," he whispered. Hannah turned to him, her smile radiant. "We did." And as Lila began chattering about her latest adventure, Elliot leaned back in the swing, content. The road had been long and hard, but it had led them here, to love, to family, to a future they could cherish. And that was everything.